I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss Ukraine's Independence Day and analyse 6 months of the conflict. We ask how Ukrainians are marking the bloody anniversary on the ground, and we hear from our correspondent Will Brown on Russian influence in Africa.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 24th of August, day 182. And today, I'm joined by senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, our Africa correspondent Will Brown, and our guest, journalist and translator from Kyiv, Alexandra Podvoroznik. I started off by asking Alexandra and Roland for the latest updates from Ukraine on this, their Independence Day.
Hi. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Well, I'd say that the atmosphere is, at once quite tense because we have been warned that Russia might try and escalate the situation even further. And yet I feel like a lot of people think that, cowering in fear is, pretty much no way to live, especially at a time like this. So they're sort of defiantly, but also carefully trying to celebrate, in their own homes and trying to be safe. And obviously, I feel like today's the day when even the people who are used to, ignoring the air raid sirens, I think even those people are taking them a little more seriously today. So not a lot of, public celebrations going on, but in the privacy of their own homes, I think a lot of people are celebrating.
May I ask, are you and your friends and family, are you doing anything special today?
Well, we're lucky enough to be in the suburbs, so we're a little bit more relaxed, I think. Although the suburbs in question, it's Hostomel, sadly a town which is now famous for, quite tragic reasons. But yeah, I think because we're outside of, Kiev downtown, we do feel a little bit safer, so we're going to be doing a barbecue, and we've invited friends over. And I think this is one of those days where everyone is trying to gather outside of the city, maybe, visit friends who are out of town, maybe just go to the suburbs, because it's easier to celebrate there, without feeling like you're putting yourself in extra danger.
Well, thank you very much for that, for giving us a sense of how people in Kyiv are thinking and marking Independence Day. Alexandra, we'll come back to you later because, of course, as well as being Independence Day for Ukraine today, it's also the 6th-month anniversary of the invasion. Roland Oliphant, can I come to you? Outside of Kyiv, outside of the Independence Day celebrations, what else is happening in Ukraine? What should our listeners know?
Well, to be honest, the Independence Day event is the key thing today, really. Today also marks 6 months since the start of the war, and there's been an awful lot of worry about the Russians making a point on this day, a doubly symbolic day. Government workers in Kiev were told not to come to work this week, to work from home. The United States told any citizens who are still inside Ukraine to get out or keep their heads down over this week, because there is an anticipation of the Russians making massive missile strikes across the country. That hasn't yet occurred as far as we can tell. Kharkiv over in the east is under a 36-hour curfew in expectation of this. The governor over there has put out on Telegram reports of a couple of missile strikes in villages around there. But I don't think we've yet seen this feared nationwide barrage that we were warned about, but everyone's certainly keeping an eye on that. President Zelensky made one of his characteristically charismatic speeches this morning to mark this. I think it's worth just picking out a couple of quotes here, partly because he does have this way of describing how the nation feels. Speaking on the 6-month anniversary of the war, a new nation appeared on the world on February 24th at 4 a.m. It was not born but reborn, a nation that did not cry, scream or take fright, one that did not flee one that did not give up and did not forget. And we'll talk about this later in the podcast, but there really is a sense in Ukraine about there was a before and an after, and the country changed on February 24th. The other thing, he restates war aims here. We will not sit down at the negotiating table out of fear with a gun pointed at our heads. For us, the most terrible iron is not missiles, aircraft and tanks, but shackles, not trenches, but fetters. Donbass is Ukraine and we will return it whatever the path may be. Crimea is Ukraine and we will return it whatever the path may be. Very clear, putting to bed this previous idea that we'll fight until the status quo ante of February 24th. He wants the land that was taken in 2014 back as well. Elsewhere, on the battlefield, British Ministry of Defence saying that Russia's Donbass offensive is making minimal progress. Russian forces are expecting a major counterattack. Operationally, Russia is suffering from shortages of munitions, vehicles and personnel. Morale is poor in parts of its military. Army significantly degraded, etc. Now, the British Ministry of Defence loves putting out this kind of thing, and I wouldn't expect them to publish anything that didn't say that Russia is having a bad time of it. However, Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, has himself said at a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that the offensive has slowed down. He puts that down to a concern for civilians, trying to avoid civilian casualties. Couple of other things. Over in Russia itself, Russian authorities have detained Yevgeny Roizman. Now, Yevgeny Roizman is a famously foul-mouthed, I suppose the kids would say based, politician. He's a former mayor of Yekaterinburg, former Duma deputy, pretty popular in his home city. He was the last prominent opposition leader of any standing still at liberty in Ukraine. Alexei Navalny's in jail. Many other people are in jail. He was still at liberty until today. There's video of him being arrested, police raiding his home. He's been able to tell reporters who showed up there that he's been arrested for discrediting the army. This is his quote: "We know everything about our country, nothing new. The case was opened for one phrase: invasion of Ukraine. I said it everywhere, and I will say it now." So basically, he's been arrested for calling the war a war, and he has been fined for this before. Russia has banned that word. And it's kind of remarkable that he has been at liberty for so long. I just want to read something he said on the first day of the war 6 months ago. I think, on the part of the authorities, this is a betrayal of its people, a tragedy. A war has begun. No one expected it, no one believed it, that it could happen. However, in the Third Reich, many people also didn't believe it. So he's openly compared the current Russian authorities to Nazis, basically, a very staunch critic of the Kremlin, now, like all the others, in prison. And the last thing I think we should note, Joe Barnes, our Brussels correspondent, has a piece on the front of the paper. British diplomats have been going around Europe warning their European colleagues not to buckle this winter. There's a fear in Britain that European allies may waver, support for Ukraine may crack in the face of this enormous inflation and energy crisis we're going to face in the coming months. And that's all from me for now.
Well, thank you very much for that, Roland. We will speak, of course, about how the country has changed, and I'll get Roland and Alexandra to come in on that later. But first, I'd like to invite, I think for the first time on this podcast, Will Brown, the Telegraph's Africa correspondent. Will, you're back in the UK for a bit, so you're in the studio with Roland. You wanted to talk about Russian actions across Africa over the past few years. And could you give us a sense of the concerns of the Russian state on the continent? And what do they actually do? How do they try and influence African countries?
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's very exciting to be here. First of all, I think this is quite a fascinating and underreported topic. So if I may, I start with a bit of background. There's a lot of sympathy for Russia on the continent for various reasons. And I think, first of all, you've got to understand that the West has quite a bad reputation in Africa. Of course, European powers carved up the continent in the 19th century, looted a lot of their art, backed apartheid regimes in southern Africa for decades, supported coups against democratic democratic leaders and back terrific strongmen. Now, rightly or wrongly, there's a widespread perception in Africa the West is constantly moralizing about democracy and liberal rights to African governments while chucking a bit of aid money their way. But that fundamentally, they're not really taking African governments that seriously and expecting them to just go along with everything the West says like grateful partners. On the other hand, you've got Russia, which never had an empire in Africa, and the Soviet Union sported a lot of anti-colonial, anti-apartheid struggles across the continent. Of course, like a lot of older statesmen still in parts of Africa still speak Russian from their time studying in Moscow. So that's the background, and so let's go to the present day. I think in around 2015, Putin started looking around the world and asking where Russia could get some influence on the cheap and disrupt Western interests. And he settled on this kind of vast swathe of Africa, stretching from the Francophone Sahel region in West Africa all the way to the Central African Republic and onto Sudan in the East Coast, on the East Coast. And these are almost all very fragile states which struggle to exert force outside their capital cities. Now, Russia started piling in mercenaries from the Wagner Group into the Central African Republic several years ago, even providing the president with security detail, protecting him against would-be putschists within his own ranks. This effectively allowed them to capture the state and won them a free pass to basically make cash however they wanted. Since then, you've had airstrips popping up all around Kharkiv, Russian airstrips. The Russians can basically fly troops in and out of the region as they please, using the country as a strategic base. The operation basically pays for itself. The mercenaries make serious money from one major industrial mine in the country, but sources tell me that they're also sending small helicopters equipped with machine guns into artisanal gold mines in the bush to loot them for everything they're worth. And this kind of helps kind of supplement the normal kind of Wagner mercenary salary. They're also in Sudan and Darfur, linked to warlords there, mining a huge amount of gold and possibly uranium in shadowy operations that we really don't know much about. Recently, they moved into Mali in West Africa, and this is quite an underreported but hugely significant coup for the Russians. Basically, they've helped to turf out the key Western power in the region, France, out of Mali after a decade of Paris fighting this losing war in the desert against jihadist groups. And I think one thing to really stress here is one of the major benefits for these various African strongmen or military juntas of using these Russian guns for hire is that you don't really get any liberal rights baggage with them. You can give Wagner a mining contract or something, and suddenly you have a decent fighting force who don't mind getting their hands very bloody with torture or mass executions. Of course, the sympathy with Russia or the refusal to stand out against Russia in Africa isn't all to do with Wagner. A lot of countries are run by more liberal-minded, technocratic governments who generally do not want to get involved in the Ukrainian conflict because they feel that they've got enough problems at home, and whatever happens, they're going to end up being inadvertent victims of this conflict through the massive price rises of foodstuffs and fuel, which in parts of Africa have gone up twice or even 3 times. Yeah.
So just on that, can I ask, what does Russia get from this? You said they got involved. Putin decided to try and influence what was going on from around 2015 and before. But what's in it for Russia in all this?
Well, I mean, there's lots of things for in Russia. I mean, one, it's they're winning things by being able to disrupt the West, by disrupting Western interests. I think for Putin, that's a victory in itself. But also, you've got to remember that Africa is the largest voting bloc in the UN General Assembly. Everyone from Guinea-Bissau to Equatorial Guinea has a vote. Now, Russia wants those votes to kind of back its agenda in the UN General Assembly. Now, there's also other things. It's also to do with raw materials. Now, before Russia invaded Ukraine, it amassed a vast kind of war chest of gold. Now, a lot of this gold, we think, is from African mines in the Sudan, mines in Central African Republic, mines in Mali. So it's about amassing those raw materials they need to make the Russian war machine keep working.
Can we talk a little bit about disinformation? How does that play out in Africa? What does Russia want people there to think, and why?
So yeah, the Wagner Group isn't all about guns for hire. They offer a full range of services, including electioneering and disinformation campaigns. And there's been reports of governments right across Africa, southern, eastern, west, and central, using these services. I think a lot of the disinformation services I've seen during the last 5 years working on the issue have been kind of centered around Francophone Africa, which I think Putin sees as a bit of a soft target. Russian bot accounts, spread disinformation about France, which is the traditional regional hegemon in the region. They're spreading disinformation about what their real mission in the Sahel is. Are they really there to fight jihadists, or are they really there to keep Africa weak and ripe for the exploitation of secret reserves of minerals in the Sahara and stuff like this? And this kind of disinformation campaign, it seems to be really working. I remember as early as 2019, 2020, we started seeing Russian flags popping up at anti-French, anti-government protests in places like Mali or Burkina Faso.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Will. Can I ask, can we draw some of these threads together and say, how is this connected to, and why is it relevant to the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, as I mentioned, I mean, it's really about. So first of all, we can look at it in terms of raw materials. So as I said, Russia has amassed this vast war chest of gold, mainly from kind of these weird, kind of shadowy nexuses of different gold miners and warlords in Africa. Now, that's one point. Second point, I don't know. At the beginning of the conflict, we remember that President Zelensky, there were assassination attempts. There was bands of Wagner mercenaries who reportedly, some of them came from Central African Republic or Libya, who went to Ukraine, deployed to Ukraine to try and assassinate Zelensky. So there's links like this, but there's also there's links around kind of earlier on in the conflict. There was a major vote at the UN General Assembly to condemn Russia and to kind of tell Russia to withdraw unilaterally from Ukraine. Now, quite a few African countries either boycotted that vote or officially abstained, it's called, because they didn't want to kind of come out on either side.
Thank you so much for all of this, Will. There's so much to get into here. Roland and Alexandra, do you have any questions for Will?
Questions. Thank you, Will. We're sharing a studio, by the way, so I apologise if you could hear me doodling as he was speaking. I think I just wanted to pick up on what he said about, all these African countries not wanting to come off the fence, if you say. I mean, part of it, I think, is definitely, as he said, kind of historic sympathy, right? I mean, I haven't worked in Africa as much as Will, but colleagues I have worked with in Southern Africa have been sending me articles in newspapers, and I read them, and it's just dripping with this sense that Moscow was the liberating force who helped us out back then. So I think that relationship is still there. That was neglected for very many years by the Russians. Russia is back in Africa and trying to rebuild from quite a low base. All of those connections have kind of decayed over the past couple of decades, but they are putting in some effort. But there's also a practical point here. So Ukraine and Russia together provide about is it half of the wheat used by the World Food Programme? Almost all of that wheat that we were talking about coming out of trying to get wheat out of Odessa, that was all going to Africa. It was going to East Africa. It was going to Egypt, places like that. And I mean, Vladimir Putin sent sent a number of people touring African capitals just a few weeks ago, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, South Africa, saying, look, we're going to make sure you get the wheat that we've promised. So yes, very much an active diplomatic game for the sympathies of those countries.
Thank you very much, Roland. Alexandra, just wondering, is there anything from you on this?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the fascinating insight. I just wanted to ask, in your opinion, I've noticed, there's a lot of outlets and just individuals, predominantly English-speaking ones, who are trying to tackle this sort of Russian disinformation online. But as I think you said, a lot of Russian disinformation is specifically targeting Africa and various African countries. Do you think Western media or just people online, for lack of a better term, are doing enough to sort of, debunk all of this propaganda? Or do you think it's something that we're missing and overlooking, and which could have, bad consequences potentially?
So I first of all, I just want to say fantastic points from both of you, and I think your point just now is absolutely key. I think we are missing this. A lot of this disinformation is not really targeted at people in the West. A lot of it is focused on people in developing countries in Africa. And I think if you look to countries like Mali, like Burkina Faso, even Kenya, where I'm currently based, this stuff is there, and this stuff is working. And I don't think Western countries, Western governments have really woken up to just how far and this stuff is going. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Will. Anything more from Roland and Alexandra on this?
I just wanted to ask, Will, I mean, is there a sense in which African publics, for whatever reason, are more receptive to this than others?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer. I think that Russia is very carefully and very cleverly tapping into a fiercely patriotic discourse, one which kind of holds the French or the British or the Belgians or the EU, whatever you like, in disregard, and they and this kind of they're tapping into this anti-colonial mindset, which is working, frankly, and yeah.
And do you think, just to follow up on this, because this is the big question, I see a lot of talk, and I cover a lot of stories around the world about Russian influence. Okay, so you go down to the Balkans, and people will talk about Russia has its foothold in Serbia or whatever, or go anywhere in the world, you'll come across this. One thing you often hear when you put this to Western officials, like, okay, there's this panic, maybe the Russians are playing around, but look at the stats, look at the money. Like, what is Russia actually offering? And how much of this propaganda is backed by real hard cash, hard support? I mean, on the whole, is the weight of influence still with the West or not?
Well, I think actually, if you look at, for example, the supply of weaponry, I think I'm not mistaken in saying that Russia is the largest supplier of weaponry to sub-Saharan Africa. They have military agreements with I think more than half of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So they are able to provide this kind of, I don't know how you describe it, probably hard power, but in terms of kind of how much money they have to back up African governments, you're quite right. It's completely negligible compared to what China or the West, specifically the EU or America can muster. So they are a small player, but they're a highly disruptive player.
Well, thank you very much, Will, for that. Alexandra, can I just bring you in here? I thought it was fascinating what Will said about how Russia is seen as almost an anti-colonial power, helping African countries against their former colonial masters. I mean, that must strike you as fairly ironic, given Russian imperialism, given Russian history in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is probably one of the most cynical lies that Russia has been putting out there. Russia right now likes to paint itself as this sort of superpower which stands against Western imperialism, Western colonialism, whatever. And frankly, I find it quite shocking that a lot of people who sort of support these ideas and repeat them somehow are ignoring the fact that Russia was literally called the Russian Empire for a very large portion of its history. And if you look at how Russia grew and how it became this huge country, it's fairly obvious that, there was a lot of colonialism involved. And it is a little worrying how Russia is trying to rewrite, Soviet history by painting itself to be, this sort of anti-racist power in the world, when in reality, both the Soviet Union and modern day Russia have huge problems, with racism, from what I can gather and from what I have heard from my, non-Slavic Russian friends. So I do think it is very concerning that, despite, the fact that the internet is sort of giving us the power to fact check all of these claims and debunk them, that obviously, not enough is being done to combat all of this.
Thanks, Alexandra. Will, is there anything more from you? Anything you didn't say, or anything you think is important to mention before we move on to talking about the 6-month anniversary?
Yeah, I think I just So I think there's one thing. I had a conversation recently with a very good friend in Kenya, and he was saying, I mean, it was quite interesting because I think he had been exposed to a bit of this kind of disinformation, and or he'd been watching Russia Today, the Russian state television program in Nairobi, and he was saying that kind of, look, well, why doesn't that NATO has clearly sort of provoked the bear, as it were, and maybe Ukraine should just give up some of this territory and then we can all go back to peace. And I challenged him. I said, well, what would you do if, for example, Britain reinvaded Kenya? And he said, yeah, we'd fight to the death.
Well, thank you very much, Will, for giving us your thoughts. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Hopefully a window into a previously potentially untouched area of discourse and events to do with this invasion that we certainly here haven't touched on. So thank you very much, Will, for that. As we said, today is the bloody anniversary of the start of the invasion back in February. I was struck by something Roland said earlier on in this chat about how there's a sense in Ukraine that there is a before the war and there is an after the war, and that sort of that marker, that the moment of invasion, before that things were one way and now they are a different way. Alexandra, can I ask you from your perspective, is how do you feel about that? Is that true? And if so, what does that mean to you? How has Ukraine changed?
Obviously, it has changed. Our society has changed a lot. And, some people, I've seen a lot of Ukrainians write on social media that, essentially back in 1991, we were, given sort of our independence on a platter. But now is the moment in history when we are, actually fighting for it. So, as if we were sort of given our independence in advance, and now we have to pay for it. I wouldn't necessarily agree with this point of view because, even before the 90s, Ukraine has had a very long tradition of, fighting for its independence and resisting sort of various attempts by Russia and, other actors of invading us and sort of trying to abuse our people, for lack of a better word. So I don't think that's a very precise description, but for a lot of people, it does certainly feel that way. I think a couple of years back, my husband and I were talking about how we're sort of, he was sad that Ukrainians don't really celebrate Independence Day, as much as, say, Americans celebrate July the 4th. And he was saying, well, why don't we have these traditions? Why don't, our shops carry sort of Independence Day merch or something? I'd maybe like to have a party on that day. And, we thought about it and we sort of said, well, yeah, it's sort of more like a formal holiday, which it doesn't really capture the hearts and minds of, regular Ukrainians. And this year, despite the fact that, most Ukrainians are sadly not in a position to really, go all out and celebrate, in the middle of Kiev because it's dangerous. I think a lot of us would like to do that. And I think that this year is the year when this sort of holiday, which for a lot of people seemed like a formality, because, a lot of people, especially from my generation, we had sort of, felt that our independence was, something that, we had unconditionally, and something that nobody would be trying to actively take away from us. And a lot of the stuff we heard from our elders about how Ukraine has had to fight for its independence, it sounded like, like history, like something that would probably not be repeating itself. But here we are, and I think a lot of people from my generation are sort of reevaluating the price of freedom, reevaluating the price of independence. So I definitely think that at least for our generation, and maybe people a little younger, a little older than us, they will definitely be taking this holiday and their identity even more seriously. A lot of people have switched to talking Ukrainian more. I do notice this, and if even 5 or 10 years back, saying that that you were a Ukrainian patriot, that for a lot of people, for a lot of younger people, it sounded a little sort of cringy and something that you wouldn't say or post about that on social media. But as a result of the invasion, even the sort of people who didn't really see their Ukrainian identity as something very important to them, they have, I feel, reevaluated that, and they are sort of reclaiming their own identity and the language, and showing a lot more interest in this.
Roland, can I bring you in at this point as well? I mean, you've been travelling Ukraine, reporting from it and on it for many, many years now. What's your reaction to what Alexandra is saying?
I mean, I see what she's saying. I mean, it's a funny business, because I think I've got a lot of sympathy for what President Zelensky said in his speech. I think there is a sense that a country was kind of reborn, and it's a bit of a It's a bit of a hackneyed, corny phrase, I suppose, and and there's ways you can nitpick. But genuinely, the way that country just came together, the way that country refused to buckle. Everybody thought they would buckle. I mean, most of the Ukrainians I know, I speak to them, and they say, well, I'm surprised we're still, after 3 days and Kiev hadn't fallen. They were surprised. It really is a remarkable thing to witness. But you know what? It's kind of not the first time. I mean, I remember 2014 being down on the Maidan in Kiev, witnessing that revolution kind of building up to its crescendo from kind of a low-key kind of protest to a bigger protest to a full-on proper bloody revolution, and the same kind of spirit on display. And amongst certain people you spoke to, there was always this sense of a tradition of, I mean, Alexander will correct me, I'm sure, if I'm getting something wrong here, but there's something in the kind of Ukrainian national sense of self about sacrifice and struggle for the nation. Sometimes it comes out in a lot of, in bravado, and sometimes you think, God, you're 17, why are you saying this, whatever. But there's a root there. I mean, I remember so I was in Lviv during the Maidan, during the January or February, just before it all ended, and I met this young lad who was signed up and put on a mask and was he hadn't actually gone to Kiev, but he was like, yes, I'm going to fight, and I told my brother to stay back because we have a tradition. He quoted this song by a famous Soviet Russian rock star called Victor Tsoy. It's this fantastic song. And one of the lines is, I will return as soon as I can. I'll return home as soon as I can, with my shield or on it. And he quoted that at me, and he said, that's who we are. And at the time, I was thinking, you're a 17-year-old kid, and it's going to be really tragic if you go off with those ideas and get yourself hurt. But I really think there's an element there that Vladimir Putin really missed about his invasion. He thought that this country was going to buckle, and everybody who'd been there, who really knew it, didn't really think that would happen. Although, speaking personally, I couldn't understand why the Russians thought this war was a good idea, because I just, we knew there was going to be a fight that the Ukrainians would fight. A lot of us kind of thought that they would fight unsuccessfully, but we knew they were going to fight. And I think that has, a country doesn't come out of nowhere. But I do think this war has fundamentally changed Ukraine. in many ways. There's the unity, there's the tragedy, there's the sacrifice. There's also, and I think this is really important, and I'd like to hear Alexandra's thoughts on this, the fundamental severing and destruction of ties with Russia, which from my point of view is a complete and utter tragedy. I mean, there's so many Russians and Ukrainians who are intermarried, so many people, cousins, brothers, sisters, mothers, in Kiev or Moscow or other sides of the border, people fighting in different armies. After 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, those relationships kind of continued. This is completely different. I mean, after Bucha, after everything else, it's a fundamental change. And I don't really think even Ukrainians know what does a country that goes through this look like at the end of it? Who will they be when finally the war ends? You never know, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the line, what an experience like this will do to a nation. I'm going to stop rambling now, and with apologies for kind of speaking in very broad generalizations. I would like to hear what Alexandra has to say about that.
Well, I absolutely agree. We are changing as a society, and I think, Ukrainians generally, obviously, I'm talking about stereotypes here, but Ukrainians generally aren't really known for getting along with one another. I think, we have these jokey phrases about how, if you get three Ukrainians in a room, you'll have two presidents, because, each one, has his own ideas of what leadership should be like. And, we argue as a society, we argue a lot. And, I think something that a lot of Westerners don't really notice is that, especially when they say things like, Zelensky is forcing Ukrainians to fight, or, whatever, this kind of nonsense. But they're missing the point that, Ukrainians generally, they don't blindly follow their leaders. And I think, 2014 and Maidan, it sort of showed the world, it should have showed the world that we are not, we don't really follow our leaders if we think they're making bad decisions. And so it's especially fascinating for me as someone who's been on Ukrainian social media all of my life. And, there's new sort of arguments and scandals and things going on every single day. But ever since the war started, I think that, Ukrainians have been a lot more, of course, we still argue, but I think our criticism is sort of much softer, and we're a lot more understanding of one another. I think that, when Zelensky won the election, a lot of the people who voted for Petro Poroshenko, they had this sort of hypothetical nightmare scenario in their heads, which they would, talk about relentlessly. And they would say that, well, what if, Russia invades? What if there's a full-scale invasion? Zelensky, he'll buckle down. He'll won't, fight. And, Ukrainians would go on and accuse each other of saying, that in, the event of an attack, you are definitely going to, betray everyone, and you're not going to fight because you're not a fighter. And I think up until the 24th, probably, each family in Ukraine would, glance suspiciously at their neighbors and think, well, we are definitely going to fight, but those guys, they're not strong enough. They'll be the death of us all. And, to our surprise, it turns out that everyone was willing to fight. And Zelensky, despite the fact that, there's a lot to criticize him for, and I personally don't agree with, all of his decisions, but he has, turned out to be a much better wartime leader than a lot of people could have hoped for. And so I think for me, it's just genuinely fascinating, because for the first time in my life, I'm seeing Ukrainians actually agreeing, with the decisions made by their government, or, agreeing with decisions made by, local governments, and sort of agreeing with one another. So it is fascinating. And obviously, this entire experience is horrifically traumatic. And, I'm sure that it will have sort of there will be a price to pay for all of this, and we're all stressed out and going through terrible things right now. But also, there is a sense of unity, and I honestly don't know how long this will last, because we had a similar sense of unity during Maidan, but obviously it didn't really last all that long. So I do think Ukrainians have this sort of weird ability to unite and to fight really, really, really bravely, when push comes to shove, and then, spend all of the peaceful time sort of arguing amongst ourselves. So I am also, very curious as to what will result from all of this. And, as I've studied sociology at university. So from that perspective, I'm, also very curious as to what effect the war and the aspect of social media in the war, and all these new connections, all of these new sort of informal institutions that have arisen from all of this, all of these people who have gotten amazing experience as volunteers, as who've had to learn so much over the past couple of months. What kind of society will be born from all of this? And there's only one way to find out. So we'll just have to keep on doing our thing and looking at what our society turns out to be like.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. We're starting to come to the end of our time, so I've just got two questions. Roland, you mentioned just then that you thought before the invasion, you thought it'd be a terrible, stupid decision by Russia to go through with it. What do you think the future for the Russian state and for Russians looks like at the moment?
I think it looks really grim. I mean, we talked earlier about the arrest of Yevgeny Roisman. I mean, not really a surprise. He was probably protected by his popularity in Yekaterinburg so far. But for kind of as long as I was living and covering Russia and living there, it wasn't. People would talk about, is Putin a fascist? And you'd get these kind of very pat opinion pieces appearing in the God bless them New York Times opinion pages or whatever, saying like, well, if you look at Weimar Germany, etc., etc., and you'd read it when you were in Moscow, it's ridiculous. I mean, what are you talking about? This is not, there was always this kind of uneasy balance between, nationalist authoritarian urges, this kind of social contract which said we're going to improve your lives, just keep out of politics, and we might get a bit tough with the Chechens, we might be pretty rough with businessmen, oligarchs who step out of line. We might, and we'll leave you in no doubt as to what we will do if you were to try and rise up and have a democratic revolution. But we're going to leave you alone. It was, I don't know, it was that whole world is gone, and now, and I have a very dear friend from St. Petersburg who, like many people, has fled the country, who wrote a very long essay about kind of what's happened, and the thing that stood out for me in that was this line where she said, I had 20 years of life, and the past 6 months have just washed it away. I think Russia's fundamentally changed. What happens when it comes out of it? I don't know. I mean, there is this idea that if the Russians lose this war, Vladimir Putin's regime can't survive. I don't know if that's true. I don't know what defeat looks like. I don't know what he can spin or what he can't spin to survive. I don't know whether, if he does go, whether he will be replaced by, people from the same kind of crazy hardline camp or somewhere else. Russians have, if we're going to talk again in outrageously offensive stereotypes, I think one of the differences that you can draw between Ukrainians and Russians generally is that Ukrainians never had a problem about going on the streets and having how many revolutions have they had in the past 30 years, right? Russians are very averse to that. They really don't like revolutions. That's one reason, and Vladimir Putin played on that really well. No one wants to go on the street and have to force a change of power in that way. They're very conscious of how you can have a revolution and you can get rid of the Tsar and end up with Lenin, and it's not necessarily a change for the better. But it doesn't look good. That Russia of the past 20, 30 years has gone, and I think you just have to look at the economic impact of this war. We're now in basically a war of economic attrition between the West and Russia, and the West is hoping Russia's horrible economic attrition is going to crack the Kremlin before the horrible economic attrition we're about to undergo with the gas crisis cracks us. That's what's basically going on, and I think I'm more deeply worried in the very long term. I'm more worried about what's going to happen to Russia than to Ukraine, because I think in my heart of hearts, and I may be completely wrong, I kind of think Ukraine is going to emerge from this war as a single whole state. And I kind of think they're probably going to win. But the fate of Russia, I think is really grim. I'm just very pessimistic. I don't know what's going to happen, but I don't have a good feeling about it.
Thank you very much for that, Roland Oliphant. We've come, I think, to the end of our time. Alexandra, would you like the final words then? I mean, I sort of deliberately asked Roland about the future of Russia because I want to end with the future of Ukraine. It's something you touched upon a little bit in your answer previously, but I wanted to know, on Ukrainian Independence Day and also the 6th-month anniversary of the invasion, what do you want the future for yourself, for your friends and family to hold in Ukraine?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that Roland has said, except for, I would like to clarify that I definitely think that Ukraine will win. It's not a question of probably, it's not a question of maybe. I think that, frankly, that's the only option we've got, because Ukraine will either be independent or there won't be a Ukraine. I do hope that we, it's not even a question of hoping. I know in my heart of hearts that we will, keep fighting up until the very end. And we have to win this thing because, otherwise the alternative is just too horrifying to imagine. But I also hope that, it's just a question of when, how soon that will be, and, how many people will have to die in the process. And, so that's why I definitely hope that our wonderful allies will keep supporting us, will keep backing us, because, obviously Ukraine will have to fight even, without their involvement. But the price of that will obviously be horrific. I definitely feel that, and I think that's, the majority of the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians are, 100% sure that Ukraine will emerge victorious, because we've seen what happens in Mariupol and Bucha and Hostomel, and we know that, as our president said, that we're not afraid of missiles, but being occupied and tortured and not being free, that is something that horrifies us. So, not a very optimistic note too, but I definitely feel that Ukraine has no choice but to emerge victorious.
Here on Ukraine the Latest, we give updates, analysis and our thoughts on the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. We thought it was only fair to give you a sense of how the newspaper as a whole thinks about the conflict. Here is our leader from today, the 24th of August. 6 months ago, Vladimir Putin unleashed his armies upon Ukraine and upended decades of assumptions about the post-Cold War world. For weeks, UK and US intelligence had been warning that the Russian president's belligerent rhetoric should not be dismissed, and that the troops massing on the border would be used in an invasion. The French and Germans were not convinced, but they were not the only ones shown up by the eventual attack. Many in the West thought that Ukraine would crumble within days. 6 months later, and it's the Russians who seem to be on the back foot. This point should not be overstated. Russia controls a significant proportion of Ukrainian territory. Putin's forces have not been routed, and it is not clear that he has fundamentally shifted from his ambition to achieve total dominance of the country. Today is also Ukrainian Independence Day, and the thread that still runs through the speeches and broadcasts of Kremlin propagandists is that Ukraine is not a real country, and that the distinct national identity claimed by its people is a fiction. The strength of the Ukrainian resistance is, of course, proof otherwise. However, Ukraine's vulnerability has always been that it is reliant on NATO countries providing the sophisticated weaponry necessary to counteract Russia's military advantages. It must surely fear that a hard winter in Europe, as well as political changes in the US after the midterm elections, will erode the resolve of politicians in the West to keep up the supply, particularly if Putin continues to use energy exports as a tool of blackmail. Germany's commitment has already been shamefully weak. So-called foreign policy realists argue that Ukraine cannot possibly win, so must be persuaded to reach an accommodation with the Kremlin. But this ignores the wider significance of the conflict. Ukraine is not just fighting for its independence and freedom, but for the principle that aggressor states should not be permitted to redraw borders through force. After Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, Western leaders convinced themselves that they had done enough via sanctions to dissuade him from going further, and that, in any case, it was not in their interest to effectively fight a proxy war with Russia. They were wrong. Among the consequences of that terrible misjudgment are the horrors taking place in Ukraine today. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear. And today on Twitter, Gemma Farrell.